witches, and welcome to a new video here on A Coven of Two, where we talk witchcraft and activism. You can call me Isha, my pronouns are she, they, and today we're gonna dive a bit into my experience of Italian folk magic, witchcraft, which we don't call that in Italy, and then how some things still influence my practice today, but mainly this is gonna be a bit of a story time on the kind of things that I was exposed to as a child. Again, we do not call it witchcraft, Stregheria, Stregoneria in Italy, but it's embedded in most of the things we do, especially in a village as small as mine. I come from a village that it's around 600 people, and I think it was 1,000 in the 1800s, but that was it, basically. So here's how we're gonna structure this video, so you know what's coming, and you also have the chapters linked in the video description down below. The first part is the most obvious part of witchcraft in Italy really is Catholicism on steroids, and so all the things that are actually technically we try to believe related to Catholicism, the saints, the local superstitions that are related to something that supposedly still have to do with Christianity. Then we're gonna go in rituals that I've done, I've seen, I'm not quite sure, I'm sure that they're still part or still seen as part of Christianity, but it wasn't the main thing of them. It was just putting ingredients together, do a ritual, and then waiting for the outcome. We're gonna talk a bit, of course, about the evil eye and the way that I've heard about it. I've sort of seen it happen. You know, it's Italy, so we'll go there. We have to go there. And then we talk about something that is called Segnature, and Dr. Angela Puca speaks specifically about it. And again, at the time, I had no perception that segnare something was actually supposedly doing a magical ritual about it, but I've gone through segnature myself, as in I was at the receiving end of them. And then we're gonna go a bit into tarot, how tarot is so embedded in the culture. As I said in my first video, everybody in my village, everybody in my main town has their regular, loyal cartomancer. It's just something so obvious and pervasive. I didn't know that it was a weird thing, really. And admittedly, we'll go into how that maybe still affects my practice today, especially when I read tarot for myself and for others. So buckle up, because we're going to Italy, and it's not always as smooth a ride as it might seem. As I mentioned before, Italy is a very young country despite the general perception of it. It officially became unified in 1861, and then it became a republic after World War II in 1946. Before that, there was still the Italian peninsula, but since the fall of Rome, it had mainly been about smaller countries and city-states, and they were all scattered around. In the north of Italy, northwest specifically where I come from, there was a lot of back and forth with Austria coming down and conquering us, and then France coming down and conquering us, which means that actually the records of my village going back to the early 1800s are actually in French, because we were France for a while. And admittedly, doing some research on this, just so I knew like what books, what things have been done, I realized that a lot of what I experienced in Italy also finds a counterpart in French. I found specifically this author, who in the 1800s wrote a good few interesting books about the origin of paganism in actual Christianity, and so how saints actually are the conversion of pagan credos that were there before, and we sort of talked about that in the video about Vesta, didn't we? And there's specifically a book in French that I haven't been able to find, that just the title reminded me, oh, okay, this is something that I need to mention, which talks about rituals for the removal of warts, which is one of the rituals that I went through, funnily enough, but one thing at a time. The first part, as I mentioned, should focus on how intrinsically related to Christianity and Catholicism specifically any kind of practice that we have in Italy is. First things first, as I mentioned, we do not call it witchcraft. We do not call it stregoneria. If anything, all these rituals that try to have prayers and call upon saints and call upon Jesus are supposed to be there to actually fight witchcraft and witches, which is very, very ironic in a way. I think the only book that I've seen talking about that, because most of the books in English are from the next generation tradition of people that have migrated. Italian folk magic is also one of those, but from what I understand, was written by a person that grew up within the Italian community in Canada. So all the traditions that they brought with them, the language was still that, there was sort of less adapting. Nothing wrong with adapting. I do believe that you adapt and you do what works for you at the end of the day. But it was interesting to hear things that are more similar to my experience rather than what I've heard about Stregheria in general, which is the Americanized version of the Italian emigrants that went to America and then developed their own way to build on the traditions that we have in Italy. I come from a family that I never perceived to be extremely religious. However, we did go to Mass every Sunday, and I was baptized, I had my first communion, I had my confirmation. It was obvious, it was just part of culture. I went to Sunday school, all of that, and it was a default, really. I think, ironically, being Italy the place that also holds the Vatican, some places take it more seriously. Where I come from, probably because it was detached from big urban centers, we had our own way to do things. Like in the years, I've then met people from Italy, elevated, educated, that because though the family is Catholic, there are things that they actually don't do and don't conceive because they come from Catholic law, Catholic rule, like people that would never want children but would never consider abortion. And that's a lot of cognitive dissonance there. Probably the reason why I went along with it, and then coming to around 16, I started to detach myself, was that a lot of things imposed by the church didn't make sense to me. And being a queer person, you can imagine where all of that comes from. But it's in general the way that the church upholds patriarchy, basically. And I think one of the main issues with Italy is not so much that it shows to be that religious, but the simple fact that the Vatican is there manifests in the sexist and misogynistic way that culture is still in Italy. And those things are intrinsically related. So I guess that's the reason why, as a woman, you start to gain respect and authority once you hit middle age in Italy. Because at that point, you become one of the elders. There's a lot of things that are not required or asked of you anymore, because you're no longer in your reproductive years, so your function in society changes. Which is also the reason why, and maybe we'll talk about this in the next video about problematics in witchcraft, I do not like nor recognize the value of the triptych vision of maiden, mother, crone, of the divine feminine, because maiden, mother, and crone identify women in the function that they have towards society, not as completely made and independent people, and that is a thing, I feel. And I think that's the reason why the nonnas and the mammas are much more valued and respected by the community and the culture than when you are a young woman or a girl. And that is extremely problematic. I will leave the issues of Italian society to another video, maybe not a video here, but Italy starts off from that, unfortunately. Still very misogynistic, is still very patriarchal, and that is not a good thing. And there's no point in being here talking about Italian tradition without highlighting that as well. The reason why a lot of magic and witchcraft and folk practices are made and established by older women, usually the nonnas, like I can't think of a person that I knew we were going to, whether it was a cartomancer, whether it was someone that would do Segnature, anything related to folk would be done by an older woman, like they would be over 50 at the very least. And I think that this idea that you need to get to that age, to that maturity, to that wisdom in a way, to practice magic and be reliable to your community, like the community counts on you at that point, has its roots problematically in the idea of you need to lose that part of womanhood that is distracting, that it's tempting, that it's... there are so many documents and comments that religious writers and saints have said about the wicked nature of women just because they are there to tempt. So there are issues. I cannot stress this enough. There are issues. So you can see why after a while, and when I sort of start to come into my adulthood, I was like, I'm good. The church, no, it's fine. Which is part of the reason why, despite how much I hear about working with saints within witchcraft, I'm being a bit resistant. Same with angels. I am trying to learn more. I have Astra to thank for this. Astra is a content creator. She has a podcast along with two other witches called Test Tubes and Cauldrons, which finds my love because tries to unite a skeptical mind with the entire concept of magic and esotericism, so I love that. And because she works with saints, with angels, with the Catholic side of witchcraft, it's getting interesting for me to dig back up that kind of background for me. But it's not something obvious. However, it's something that, again, I have seen very often. Something that I've done since I was a child was in the nights of June, between the 23rd and 24th, which is St. John, and between the 28th and 29th, which is St. Paul and Peter, there was this tradition of leaving a bottle of water outside with an egg white. And the idea was that in the morning you would see the shape of a sail or multiple. And it's just something that we did. And the peculiar thing was indeed that, like that, giving that shape would happen only in those nights and not if you do it any other night. The scientific explanation is that the difference in temperature between day and night makes that happen, basically. But on a practical level, it's a tradition that has been done for I don't know how long. And because I come from a village of farmers, the main reason that was done, apparently, was that the higher the sales that would come up, the better the harvest would have been. Basically, it was a way to do divination about how the harvest would come. One of the specific things, if you were to do the one on the night of St. Paul and Peter, would be not only that it would tell you about the harvest, but you would see a more defined sailboat, because supposedly that was the night in which St. Peter would come to prove to you that he is there and he exists, and he would prove the existence to the faithful people that would do this ritual by showing the sailboat, basically. I remember since I was a very small child, some of the fairy tales, equivalent of fairy tales that you would be told before sleep, were actually the story of saints. One of the main ones that I remember was Santa Rita da Cascia, and supposedly she had stigmata from a nail coming from the crown of nail of Christ on a crucifix. And she is, I think, considered a saint of impossible things, because just before dying she asked for a rose, and it was winter, and everybody thought that she was being delirious, but lo and behold, they go outside and they do find a white rose in a bush, and they bring it to her before she dies. I think that's the reason why she's named the Saint of Impossible Things. Hello, Stelina. Would you like to come here? Yes, good, Stelina. I told you I could promise you a cat. Apparently, fun fact that I discovered while I was researching for this video, Santa Rita da Cascia was the main saint that was called upon on social media during the COVID pandemic, asking for people to be saved, to be cured of COVID. So, as I told you, this kind of thing is still very, very current and real in Italy. We have actually a local saint where I come from. I mean, everywhere in Italy has a local saint, like somebody that was in that area and then died, did at least a couple of miracles, because then he was beatified and then canonized as a saint. And there's this priest who died in the 40s, who is a saint from my region, and he's called Don Orione. And the bizarre thing about him, apparently, is that he died in the 40s. He was exhumed for some reason in the 60s, and when he was exhumed, his body was untouched. Like it didn't decay like it should. And after that, they put it in this glass coffin for everybody to see. And I remember seeing this corpse when I was really, really young. And it looked bizarre, it looks a bit mummified, but indeed, they have done nothing to embalm this body, and it just kept that way. It is peculiar, at the very least. The way that he was beatified first and canonized after was by doing miracles, by saving lives, basically. I think the main thing that happens in this kind of miracles is you have an ailment or an illness that everybody is agreeing is going to kill you soon, and somebody prays or intercedes towards this dead person that was relevant, like, to the area, like Don Orione was. And I think the first miracle that was canonized on him was this guy who had a kind of meningitis that was not curable, and he was given like very, very little to live. And his mother put a picture of Don Orione on his pillow, praying to Don Orione that he would live for at least another 24 hours, and then by that time his father would have also arrived, so he could have said goodbye. But bizarrely, within a day of this picture being put there, this guy at some point just woke up from this coma, the high fever passed, and it's considered kind of miraculous that this thing could just disappear, because it's sort of medically inexplicable. And usually when even the medics and the doctors agree on that, and then these things happen, that's when you sort of have a miracle. A similar thing happened when he was canonized. It was canonized in 91. A relatively older man, like in his 70s, was diagnosed with a certain type of cancer, quite terminal, prayed to Don Orione. At the next scan, he had nothing, and he still lived over a decade on top of that. It's this kind of thing that makes saint. And then we take it up to 11 in Italy, because when this kind of things start to happen, we do a lot of ex voto. What is ex voto? It's actually something that comes originally from Egyptian and Roman paganism, and it was the practice of making physically a representation of a part of the body that had an ailment that you would offer in exchange for the promise of this spirit, entity, saint, to help you, to cure you. And apparently in the 1400s, it was a lot of paintings. But something that I've seen always, constantly, in my childhood, were these sanctuaries with a lot of silver hearts, or even organs made of silver, like kidneys, lungs, not only hearts. And they always came with the writing per grazia ricevuta, which is by the grace received. And usually they would be given after the grace was received. So there was a vow made to a saint. One of the ways that you would thank them would be by bringing this sculpture of silver. And there are sanctuaries where they are cathedrals, and every single spot on the walls has one of these. Completely normal, part of Catholicism, officially. But again, of very obvious pagan descent. Now we can go into something that is not necessarily so strongly related to saints and Catholicism, but I kinda get that those were specific rituals. So something that I remember hearing, like as a child, again, my mother was around different cartomancer, different kind of mediums and sensitives, people that would do automatic writing, and one supposedly was channeling Pope John the 23rd. It's actually, when I went to clear out my childhood home last year, I found some things of my grandparents, which I was very happy to keep. And I found these packs of, I thought were letters. In reality, no, they were pages and pages of automatic writing from this woman that my mother knew, who was supposedly channeling Pope John the 23rd, talking to my mother through her. As you can tell, the thing about how diffused and common these things are in Italy is that it's very, very easy to then make them scams. So I think one of the reasons for my skepticism of anything that was witchcraft was still connected to these things that I had seen as a child, and I was a bit skeptical about, to say the least. Something that I went through were very common when I was a child, having my worms assigned. Now, when it was said like that, my understanding was that whatever indigestion I was having was due to the fact that I had caught worms. As much as it's not that common for like children to catch worms anymore, because health and sanitation is so much better than it was like in the 1800s. But that was what I was hearing and being told. And so beside being given like vitamin Bs for digestion and stuff like that, I would be brought to have my vermi segnati, to have segnature done on me for that. And basically it would be things like where this older woman would need to like see my belly and do gestures on that while saying words and prayers that had to do still like with Jesus and God, but we were, it was this kind of ritual. And then something that as a child I absolutely hated, but I was forced to do, was eat things with garlic, because supposedly garlic would push back and push away the worms, which in hindsight I realize worms was a word for evil. I was, to their perception, somewhat possessed, and that's why I was like throwing up and foaming, and therefore that was as close, I guess, to an exorcism that I personally got to. And I remember that every time I would start to smell garlic, I would be worried, because it was like, oh, my evening soup is not gonna be nice to eat because it's gonna have cloves of garlic, and I'll have to like find a way to hide them because I don't want to eat it. I'm 3 years old, I don't like garlic, but I'm supposed to eat it because it will keep away the worms, aka the evil spirits. There was a lot of salt put around the perimeter of the house, especially when I had the worms. So that's another thing that I found is shared, and in a way I still do. It's still part of how you cleanse and how you ward. Salt is the first thing that you go to. You don't have anything else witchy in your house, but you're not quite comfortable and there's something going on in your house. Salt. Salt is more than half the job done. And that was the case even at the time. Something else that used to be done to me as I was a child, anytime that I would have earache, polenta would be cooked. Polenta is basically maize flour. It's sweet corn dried and then made into flour, and then you cook it. Polenta is something very typical of the northern regions of Italy. Polenta would be cooked and then it would be put into aluminium foil, and I would have to keep that on my ear for 20-30 minutes until it was warm. And admittedly that made the pain go away. Like, I think it was more the warmth rather than whatever kind of tradition it was, but that was a thing that I if I had earache, I would still do, honestly. The last thing that I remember is a ritual that was done to me relatively late. I think I was 10 years old, something like that. So since I was a child, I had warts on my right knee. And first it was one big one, and then it became more because they kept scratching them, and so they went around. Not clever, I know, but when you're a child, what you gonna do? And we try to do anything and everything, because apparently it's a very bad thing to have, but they don't go away. Until eventually my mother is given a ritual to do. And do we do it? We need to find a well somewhere lost in the countryside, somewhere where I will never go back to. And we find this well. It needs to be done in the summerish or late summer because we need a fig fruit. Because the top of the fig excretes this white liquid, which was called fig milk. So supposedly we need to go to this well with a fig. The fig milk is put on my warts, and then I have to throw the fig behind my back into the well and go away and never look back. Okay, we do this, but me being a child and liking to go against any rule that is given to me, once we're in the car and we've done all of this, I look back. Funny story. The warts did go away within a year. Not so funny story. They went away because within a year I fall on some gravel, I open my knee to the bone, and then the simple fact that then the flesh had to be reconstructed and rebuilt from scratch, and so I didn't have the warts anymore. Magic works in mysterious way and usually takes the path of least resistance. And I can see that. I remember hearing a lot about the evil eye and how it would attach itself to people with bad intentions. And so, little anthropology here. Historically, because Italy has been divided and it's been all these little city-states that weren't particularly one more powerful than the other, they lack a cohesive identity. You can see that in the different traditions of every region. There are 20 regions in Italy, and there are more dialects than that, and there are more traditions than that. But also this meant that we lack a unified identity. And because we come from all these small city-states that could have disappeared the next day if other city-states decided to go against it, we have this weird, small view of the world where everybody else is coming for us, so we need to protect ourselves. And if anyone else has got anything good from the world, certainly they are taking it from us. There's this natural embedded mentality of scarcity that fosters a lot of jealousy. And so I think that because of that, the simple idea of the evil eye coming from a thought of jealousy is relatively common, because jealousy and not feeling like you ever have enough is embedded in the fact that Italy is a young country and always felt like from the little city-states needed to watch their back and needed to take care of their own little garden, watching out for people coming for you and taking things from you, which is also the reason why Italy was a very fertile territory for fascism, but that's another story for another time. So because of that, the evil eye is something that can attach itself to you if somebody even thinks of, oh, fucking hell, like, I wish I had that hairpin, that kind of thing. The weirdest thing for me, though, was not like the kind of rituals that we know about finding out if there is the evil eye and how to dispel it. So the bowls of water, the drops of oil, the cutting the drops of oil, da 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 da. No, the weirdest thing for me was hearing repeatedly that there were physical manifestations of the evil eye. And one of the main things that I remember, and it happened more than once, were people talking together about this occurrence of when they got the evil eye. After a while, they started to feel that there were harder spots in their pillows where they sleep. And once the pillows were opened, there would be these bundles of hair and dirt and twigs and bad things that technically, as they said, as they believed, couldn't have got there in any way. And I would really like to remember if I've actually seen some of these bundles or if I've just heard about them. But that was really peculiar. Like there was a physical manifestation of this knotted anger, sort of. But then supposedly once these bundles were found, they were dispelled and then the evil eye was gone. So that is something, I don't know if it happened anywhere else, but in Piedmont it was definitely a thing. Last bit comes from tarot, and I leave it for last because then it connects to my current practice. I think tarot is the one thing that I've carried with me from my childhood. I don't remember my mother reading tarot, but when, again, I went to my childhood home to empty it, I found that we had multiple decks. The decks in Italy, as you might have heard, are based on the Marseilles tarot rather than the Rider-Waite-Smith, and I've always seen Marseilles. I hadn't seen a Rider-Waite-Smith until I started to practice here, and then my wife actually got me my first deck, and that is based on Rider-Waite-Smith. But that's why I'm used to see the major arcana, the court cards, but then all the pips are just numbers of items, whether they are pentacles, cups, so on. Something that since I've realized, and I would like to understand more, but I don't know who to go to ask, was that the main cartomancer of our village, Maria la Cieca, was indeed, as the word say, cieca, which means blind. And so the fact that she was blind, and yet she was the main person you would go to have your tarot read. Something that I remember, and I think it's related to the Marseilles tarot rather than Italian tradition, but if you know any different, let me know, is the fact that beside having, justice and strength are number 11 and number 8, respectively, in the Rider-Waite-Smith. For the Marseilles is the opposite. Justice is number 8, and then strength is number 11. Consider that the first decks of tarot that we have traced back are from the 14th, 15th century and were indeed made in North Italy by the Visconti and Sforza families, which were around Milan, so relatively close to where I'm from. And as much as it's nice to think that they are this esoteric thing coming from ancient Egypt and stuff like that, on a practical historical level, that's not the case. Playing cards were indeed supposedly coming from the Middle East, and then the way that we turned them into tarot, it was an Italian thing, and they were a game. They weren't supposed to be divination until the 1800s. And at the time, the major arcana weren't numbered. So the order that we gave them in divination, it's a thing that is very recent. It's the last few hundred years. Just to demystify a bit the idea that it's this magical tool coming from millennia ago. It isn't. It doesn't make it any less magical because we assigned those meanings to it, but just to specify historically. Something that beside the number switch was different was the way that the Hanged Man, the Fool, and the Magician specifically, that I remember of, were seen as bad cards. The Fool was not seen as innocent and taking chances and the world is upon you, was taken as madness, was taken just as insanity. It wasn't good for that. The Magician is not called the equivalent of magician in Italy. It's called the con man, basically. So when you had the magician, the Bagatto, coming out, it was about deception, it was about being made a fool of, and that kind of thing. And the Hanged Man specifically was not about sacrifice or seeing things from a different perspective at all. The Hanged Man was about hesitation, about not being able to take decisions, about hanging between choices. So it was more, if anything, of a Two of Pentacles than the vision that we have of the Hanged Man. And I'm just mentioning it because when I started to read tarot last year then, I had a very hard time switching my mindset from seeing those as negatives and turning them into potentials. And I think the Rider-Waite-Smith has done an amazing work in turning the potential of cards around, and maybe in the Marseille tradition and the Italian tradition, we are more disillusioned about tarot? I'm not sure. I would be very, very happy to hear what you have to say on the merit. And I mentioned tarot last because, again, as I mentioned in the first video, I think my main work in witchcraft is with deity work, ancestor work, and divination through tarot. And divination through tarot to me is peculiar because, I will never stop mentioning it, I don't think I have a particular attitude towards energy. I don't hear spirits in an obvious way, anything like that. However, and I've noticed this since I started to read tarot for my friends, I am impeccable at that. I don't read that well for my own self, but with them is always impressive. And I don't even do very complex readings for my friends. I don't do Celtic crosses or anything like that. I just stick to 3 cards, either past, present, or future, or a variation of that. And every single time that there's a party, there's an event, someone knows and comes to ask me, will you read my cards? Will you give me a reading? And I always go around with a tarot deck, so it's fine, I don't mind. And every single time, I never have the assumption to know, like, if they ask me a question or they give me a topic, then I just interpret the cards that they are given. Admittedly, when I read for someone else, it's easier for me to tap into my intuition. I guess because I do like daily readings for myself and I am more involved in my life. I have not such an easy time to just precipitate meanings down to one thing. But when it's someone else, and sometimes it happens with people that I don't know. Like last time that I was at a party, there was someone, most people that I did a reading for were people that I was meeting there for the first time. And they would just give me a generic idea or topic, and then they would pick the cards. And admittedly, something that I've also kept, that I've seen in Italy, that I don't know if other people do, but I've started to do because I've seen it done there, was when I shuffle the cards for someone, I ask them not only to focus on their question, but not to cross anything. You do not have your legs crossed, you don't have your arms crossed, and that's something that I've always heard every cartomancer do in Italy. And I can imagine that it's about energy somewhat. If you bring proxemics and the study of body language into the reasoning why you're doing a reading, if you have anything crossed in body language, it could be that you're being protective or closed off. And therefore, you might not need anything crossed while somebody is shuffling the cards for you or you're getting a reading done, because that way, basically, your energy stays open to not only get the information from the cards, but to let your energy go into the cards. I always give them deck to shuffle a bit to the person who I'm reading for, and then I'm panning the cards out and I ask them to pick 3 cards with the left hand, because it's something that I've always seen done that way as well. And I think it's because the left hand not only is the receiving end, and so you're receiving answers, but it's also the hand of the heart. So nothing crossed, left hand, this is how I do readings. And I'm always, I always find it uncanny when people get shocked, because I'm like, are you sure? I'm always like, are you sure? Like, I'm just, this is the first impression that I get from these cards. Like, does it resonate at all? And I've never had someone tell me no. If anything, they were shocked because how can you know this? And I was like, I don't, the cards do. But this is my experience with what I remember of Italian folk magic. Do not call it witchcraft, they will not like it. And I think, again, the one book that I've heard of in English that is quite accurate, because it talks about emigrants of Italy doing still their tradition, which wasn't necessarily adapted much, is Italian folk magic, and I will put a link to that into the description down below. If you know of anything else that is in the English language, please do let me know. I know of a couple others, but for what I've read of them, maybe it really works for the way that Stregheria has been adapted into second generation for Americans, but personally I do not find the things that they talked about near enough my experience to link them to this specific video. I'm not saying that it's not valid, it absolutely is. It's just not my own experience, and we're talking about that here. That's all. I hope this video was useful. If you'd like to ask me anything or leave me any comment or let me know your thoughts about reading tarot. Did you know about the cross thing? How do you read tarot for yourself, for other people? Have you done anything about Segnature? Have you ever had the worms that turns out to be evil? How do you deal with the evil eye? All those things. Let me know your opinions in the comments. If you have any questions, leave them there. I love to hear. And because apparently I have to value my work before I expect you to value it, I will mention now that I have also opened a Ko-fi, which is similar to Patreon. You can do a one-off donation or a repeated donation every month. And that way you support me being able to do these videos, maybe improve my equipment, and we can be here more. And then in time, I'll actually figure out if you think that it's worth bringing any kind of side content there. I still have a hard time finding self-value in that, but if you find it useful, let me know and we'll do more. And until then, I hope that we can axe the patriarchy together, because there is need for it, for Italy especially.